what actually makes cultures like unifies them is actually out of those failure narratives. And so what Joseph Campbell talks about is that, you have these stories that exist that are your hero's journey stories, but the things that actually bind those community together are the rituals that are in place that actually allow for failure narratives to be shared. And what we
Yeah.
see more and more in organizations, DuPont's a good example, um, MITRE's a good example, is that they have started to institute um, these these rituals where people get together and actually share those failure narratives. And so
Yeah.
now you get a lot more community building with storytelling within organizations. So I agree with you. Those who tell the stories rule the world. Those who tell stories of success, those are really good for their purposes. But those stories of failure actually build communities and actually bring people together, in my
It
view.
seems like when we're talking about failures, usually people are really welcoming stories about failures, and then in the end, you succeed. That's the journey, actually, right? You're doing something; it's really hard, and you overcome it. The stories which are only failures, when you are staying on the ground, are less popular, right? And there are more of them, I guess,
The,
especially in innovation and in startups, and right?
and this is absolutely true. So, what I think about with that point is that when we share stories around innovations, innovation stories do not exist in this paradigm of you have a beginning, you have this climax, and then you have an end. It is something that actually an innovation story is fragmented, and so you see it being fragmented over time. And so the innovation is going to, you're figuring out what is the next step, what's the next pivot. And so when you're sharing your story, in most cases, it's some fragment of this greater narrative, or this greater epic. We call it the innovation epic, but it's this larger continuum. And so the point is that, can we get to a point that we can push this thing all the way through? Yeah, we don't want our projects to fail at all, but but we know that there's going to be a lot of failure along the way.
Right.
And so, it's always important to think about the innovation stories being very small fragments of an overall innovation epic that
Yeah.
hopefully at the end is going to lead to success.
Yeah. So thank you for the user is asking. It reminds me of what's the definition of success, Churchill's definition, you know? Yeah,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
he said it's going from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm.
I, I honestly had not heard that, but I really appreciate that.
I think
Well,
it's a good definition.
absolutely. Well, and so you find yourself failing a lot in innovation, right? So my background, I'm a chemist, so I'm an R&D chemist by training. I've come into the world of storytelling because I'm really passionate about how information gets communicated. But as a chemist, you constantly are in the process of failing. And you're trying. We call it failing, but it's you're figuring things out. But reactions don't always work, and you might make a batch of material that's bad, and you could get a result that leads you down the wrong road. So you're constantly testing, retesting, figuring things out. So you're constantly trying to navigate um, this whole identity of being a failure within your science, and it can be a challenge at times trying to work through that whole process. And one thing that I've always told people is that one of the most important reasons why you share failure stories and why you share stories in general is that it's hard when things aren't working to want to go back to the lab each and every time, because
Yeah.
you do lose that enthusiasm. You do lose the momentum, and how you're expected as a scientist that you're going to go back because you love science to go back and do that work every single day, and that becomes a challenge. And so giving those spaces where people can actually share their experiences and share their struggles is really important for that whole motivation aspect.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that they're not the only one who's failing, right? Just
Yeah.
to think that it's human to fail, and we're all like in our lives, in our professional life, in the business, in wherever, we're failing all the time. And the question is not whether we failed or not, because it's always yes, we are sometimes failing. The
Yeah,
question is what we do about it, right? So
absolutely. So, what is your experience with that, Adi?
so I'm working a lot with startups in Israel, so I'm so familiar with super excited, enthusiastic people, motivated people, and they're doing all the right things, and it's failing. And I think that 96, 98% of startups are failing in the world, which is like
Mm-hmm.
most people are hearing only about the exits and the
Oh,
unicorn, right?
yes, absolutely. It's the hero story. They overcame, but it's not
Yeah,
everyone's story. And it's
of course.
amazing that some of these startups. So we work with a lot of startups in a similar way, mostly from the storytelling aspect. They can have an absolutely knockdown story that just makes so much sense, and it still does not necessarily dictate that they're going to be successful because there's so many other things happening in the market. There's so many dynamics, and the markets can shift so fast, and the interest can shift so fast. We do a lot of work in digital health, and so that is an area that we see, companies that are just going great,